My name is Jeiri Flores. I am from Rochester, New York, and I am 30. I was born in Puerto Rico, and what happened there, it's so funny because I just recently learned this. They had originally diagnosed me as like being Mongoloid, which is hilarious to think that I was born in the 90s, and this is the terminology that was used. But then we moved to this United States, and I was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. Essentially, what cerebral palsy really means is that the way your brain works is it sends messages off to your different body parts, even to your tongue, like to speak. And so when you have cerebral palsy, your messages are a lot slower than everybody else's, and so you don't necessarily move or your body just doesn't operate like everybody else's because those messages are slower. So for me specifically, I have spastic quadriplegia, meaning that all of my limbs were affected by my cerebral palsy, but that's not the case for everyone. Cerebral palsy can look different in every being with cerebral palsy. So they could attack your limbs, they could attack your intellectual, capacity. They can impact your speech. So it just varies. For me specifically, it's just my limbs, and so I use a wheelchair to get around. I can't really clearly remember like what that diagnosis was like. I always make the assumption that my parents felt some sort of relief, because prior to that, they didn't have any like real working knowledge outside of this Mongoloid title that I was given, or that I was lazy, or just a slow baby. So like having finally like an actual reason made more sense, I think, and probably created some relief for them. But how it really impacted me is as I aged, like you could tell that I was different. Being able to go over to a friend's house to play is not the same when you are in a wheelchair and you have to navigate, needing a ramp to get into someone's house, like how to use the bathroom. Like there's all these other things that you have to think about. And our other kids' parents willing to take that on. So I really hung out with a lot of my cousins for most of my like youth, I would say. I was invited to the playground, but not invited to play. I think growing up, really, that was the harder part for me is not fitting in certain places. And not that I was bullied, but like not having the actual access that everybody else had. Like I didn't even get to go to summer camp until I was like in the 4th grade. Like I didn't get those experiences that a lot of young people get because they just weren't accessible and people weren't planning for kids with disabilities and all of those. I went to Europe with my friends, and one of the things that was so beautiful in this trip was that there were parts of Europe that we weren't able to go to. So we weren't able to go to the Vatican, and we weren't able to go to the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Even though we were in Italy, we weren't able to go because it just wasn't really accessible there, right? But not once did my friends complain that we didn't get to see these huge monuments that we had previously planned for, right? Like not once did they were like, oh my God, we can't go. Like this is stupid. We went this far and can't do it. And, and they were willing to take some risks. I went to Pompeii because this weird taxi man, he was willing to throw my wheelchair in the back of his Fiat, which is hilarious because if you look at a power chair, they're about the same size as a Fiat. Like, they're not real, but he was like, I can do it. I can fit it in the trunk. And my friend looked at me and she was like, are you sure you want to try this? And I was like, yep, we're going to make it to one of these landmarks. We're going to make it, And, but this was the first time that not only was I at the playground, but I was playing, right? Because I got to go to Pompeii. I got to, see it. We were in one of the little gladiator domes. Like it was, we got to see most of well, it's hard to see a lot of Pompeii in a couple hours, but like we saw some of it because we took that leap, right? And we threw the chair in the Fiat, and he was like, don't worry, the parking lot people will help me. They're my friends. And so he just got random folks to help him lift the chair out of the car. And it was hilarious, like how it all played out, because it was not what I was used to in America. Rarely do you see a taxi driver that's trying to go out his way to help someone with a disability, get to where they got to go. Like it's a rare. Alfredo said he was coming back in 2 hours. In 2 hours, Alfredo was in the parking lot. No one said anything to make it seem like, oh my God, because of your damn chair, like we missed out going to see the Vatican. Like it was no issue. And I look forward for those moments because I know that there are other times where they're frustrated that they've missed out on something because it wasn't accessible or, you know, like they couldn't figure out how to make it work. And they're not upset that they missed it. Like, I think that I've been lucky. They're more upset that we missed it, that this wasn't something that was accessible. So like, since I was a freshman in high school, we've been friends. And then there's some that I've picked up along the way from college, but we've been friends for over a decade. Like, these are just my people. There's no telling like who I'd be, you know. I think that would set like such a ripple to changing who I am. This is like an integral part of me. It's in my bones. And so I just don't think that like, I wouldn't change it. I would change the system more than changing who I am. I think that as a person with a disability, I had to work so hard to learn to love myself. And I'm not saying that I love myself every day. And I'm not saying that every day is easy and that I like am chipper or whatever. Even just to be honest, before this interview, I was like, damn, like I am not in a good place today. So I hope I don't say something super uber depressing to this man because that's going to be awkward. But, you know, it took me a long time to accept me, right? So I might not love me every day, but to accept me, it took me a long time to get there. And it's because everything around me is telling me that I shouldn't like myself. Everything around me is lacking in representation of people that look like me. Even on TV, like the representation that you see of people with disabilities are mostly predominantly white folks. And then also they're just not even my body type, right? They're these women who are like the most beautiful women that you find who happen to be disabled. I also happen to be a woman of color, like, you know what I mean? So there's no other representation on TV to really show who I am, like, you know, to me. And so everything is pointing out that I should dislike what I look like, or that I should work uber hard to fit into this able-bodied world. You know, I worked so hard to get here. So why would I even think about changing anything? Like, this took a lot of work. And so I'll take the bad days, but I won't change anything. I think that there are so many parts of our realities that just remain hidden and people just don't talk about out loud. And so people act like they don't exist, right? Because I don't say it out loud, it doesn't matter, it doesn't happen. It's like, but no, like it does matter and it does happen. And it's not easy to always talk about it. It's not easy to be that person that always have to be the one to say, hey, this is an issue, this is a problem. And then when you're someone like me who has all these intersecting identities, like you're like, it could be a number of things as to why something is a problem for me, right? I often don't know what's going to be. Is it going to be because I'm disabled, because I'm a woman of color, because I identify as Black, because I'm young? There's so many hidden realities to people with disabilities that we often don't talk about, I think, out loud, because we don't want to elicit pity, but we also just don't want to deal with that, like, because there's no solution either. Like, there's no solution to that unless like there's a huge systemic change. Prime example. I went to a college that was in existence for 176 years, 176. And I wasn't allowed to take a biology course because the lab was not accessible. Like the professor just flat out refused, said I could not be in her class, said her department would not buy a microscope that was accessible for me to look at organisms. Like she just flat out was deciding. And the woman who worked at the Department of Office for Students with Disabilities was in agreement with her. And she was like, well, maybe you can just go to the lecture. But in order to graduate it, you needed a science with a lab, which was 4 credits. And what they offered to me was, well, you can purchase an additional $100 curriculum and do an online lab. And when the kicker was that when you Googled how much of this microscope would cost, it was $126. Her department couldn't afford $126 so that I could participate in the lab. And she refused. There is no piece of the world that we are just really built to be included in, because people continuously build these institutions to work and operate in this way. It takes so much longer for people who are not disabled to recognize this about people with disabilities, that we are more alike than different. Because also we don't often get to share spaces. Think about like the last time you were out and about, like at the mall or whatever, these places where we fellowship. How often do you see people with disabilities? Not just as patrons, but as employees, as people who do all these extra things, like, you know, like everyone else. How often do you see them? And so how often do you get to fellowship? How, you know, think of when you were in college, how many disabilities did you see on your campus? You know, I don't need these specialty things built for me. I don't need to be like excluded or moved or segregated to these spaces because, you know, if I take a deep breath and you take a deep breath, the same thing literally happened. Our lungs expand and they released air out. You know what I mean? There are multiple levels in which we have yet to defeat segregation. And so like, it's such a healthy sport, and it's so disheartening that, you know, we're still playing this game. And I also think that people with disabilities have not had their huge moment in history so that we can look back and be like, oh my God, that changed, right? Like the ADA passing is huge to me, but it is not necessarily huge to folks who like the ADA doesn't help. Like who, you know, if you're an able-bodied person, you know, who like doesn't have to worry about ramps, accessibility, whatever the case may be, then the ADA passing means nothing to you. Then the 504 sitting means nothing to you. We have to move from this place of being tolerant and into acceptance. And then once we get there, that's when we can really defeat segregation. But until we get there, like this is the game that we'll always be playing. I'm a huge fan of the Black Panthers, but one of the things that they were so keen on that was like a core belief of theirs was that their liberation, everyone's liberation was tied, right? No one could be free until we were all free. And until we all really believe that, we're going to be in this constant hamster wheel trying to figure out how to make things better, right? If women don't view me as a woman, then it doesn't matter what that woman does to fix women issues if she didn't include me in her definition of woman, right? And we are talking about equal pay. It doesn't matter how many conversations we have about equal pay if we're not also considering that people with disabilities work for sub-minimum wage. We are all tied together. We are each other's business. And so it's really important to really start looking at ourselves this way. And that's why we would move from tolerant to acceptance, right? We accept everybody for who they are and what they could do. Even when you have a great doctor, the healthcare system is bad. And I think for mental health, I think it's just one acknowledging that access to mental health when you have a disability is so hard. I would love to have a therapist. I would love to have access to a mental health care provider. And even that's my goal of 2021. Like that's to find someone that I can talk to and work through some issues that I have. Mental health folks, like to acknowledge that people with disabilities also might need your services. Like that's huge, but also do your own homework. Like don't have me come into your office and do like basically an in-service before we get to my issue, because that's not going to work for me. I don't need to be able, I don't like, that's not fair to me. If I got to explain to another doctor what cerebral palsy is, like that's problematic to me. We hold doctors to such this high standard, but when it comes to people with disabilities, like they just don't know enough. Right? Any provider, any healthcare provider, honestly, doesn't know enough about people with disabilities. So we're in this constant like stage where I'm not only educating, but hoping that this education will lead to some sort of solution for me and whatever my issue may be. As a provider, educate yourself, take a moment to pause and say, hey, what don't I know? What might I be missing? And how can I do this better, right? And also just understand the system, because as a provider, you have so much power. What you write matters, how you write matters, how you describe people with disabilities matters. So take a second and that's a lot of pressure, but take a second and just pause and say, how can I do this better? You know, who could I be talking to? Who can I connect with so that I can be a better provider? We're actively working to achieve personhood. You know, there is no shape, way, and form, in my personal opinion, that we are considered to be people yet. Because if we were, it'd be easier to live life. And so I think it's really to take into consideration in the spaces that you're in, who don't you see, who isn't there, who isn't present, and who should be. When you're crafting a message, when you're saying something, are you being performative or are you really behind what you're saying? I urge you to think about our community and how you look at folks and what you look at folks. You know, and think about like this sameness. Like I said earlier, like we are more alike than we are different. People with disabilities, it is like scientific fact that we are social creatures and we need friends in order to live and succeed and just be people. And so be conscious of that, that people need this. So when you work at an institution that is creating opportunities, you know, don't just create this opportunity, then you hire this one disabled person, who you did that, but then you make their life so difficult that they hate going to work or that they struggle in that space. Don't create spaces where people can't flourish. And just be conscious of the gardens and flowers that you're cultivating. And if you really are about making the world just a better place, and that, you know, it should take you just a second to pause and think about that.